In a small village, a cat named Whiskers discovered a magic fish in a pond. The fish promised 3 wishes in exchange for its freedom. Whiskers wished for endless fish, a cozy bed, and a bell that rang softly. The fish granted all 3 wishes and swam away, leaving Whisk. The merchant vessel Northern Star cut through the choppy waters of the North Atlantic, her massive engines humming with steady power. Captain Rodriguez stood on the bridge, watching the sun disappear behind thick gray clouds that promised a rough night ahead. The ship carried valuable cargo bound for Liverpool, and the crew of 23 men had been at sea for 8 days without incident. Chief Engineer Marcus Thompson wiped sweat from his forehead as he completed his evening inspection of the engine room. The twin diesel engines had been running smoothly since they left port in Halifax. Everything appeared normal until he noticed a slight vibration in the starboard engine mounting. He made a mental note to check it again in the morning, but for now it seemed minor. At 11:47 p.m., the first sign of trouble appeared. Junior Engineer Davis was monitoring the control panel when he noticed the oil pressure dropping on the starboard engine. He immediately called Thompson, who rushed down to investigate. By the time Thompson reached the engine room, warning lights were flashing across multiple systems. The oil leak was worse than they initially thought. A critical seal had failed, causing lubricant to spray across the hot engine block. Thompson knew they had to shut down the starboard engine immediately to prevent catastrophic damage. He gave the order, and half their propulsion power vanished into silence. The ship's speed dropped significantly as they relied solely on the port engine. Captain Rodriguez received the report with growing concern. They were still 2 days from port, and weather conditions were deteriorating rapidly. The waves were getting higher and the wind was picking up strength. Running on one engine in rough seas was manageable, but far from ideal. Thompson and his team worked through the night trying to repair the damaged seal. They had spare parts, but replacing the component required precision work in cramped conditions. The constant rolling of the ship made every task more difficult. Tools slipped from sweaty hands, and maintaining balance while working with heavy machinery became a constant challenge. By dawn, they had made some progress, but the repair was more complex than expected. The seal failure had caused additional damage to surrounding components. Thompson realized they needed at least another full day to complete the work properly. He reported this to the captain, who calculated their position and fuel consumption with growing unease. The weather forecast brought more bad news. A major storm system was approaching their position, with winds expected to reach 60 knots within 12 hours. Captain Rodriguez faced a difficult decision. They could continue toward Liverpool on one engine and risk being caught in the storm while still far from port, or they could seek shelter and wait for calmer conditions. As the morning progressed, the seas became increasingly violent. Waves crashed over the bow, sending spray across the deck. The single engine struggled to maintain their course against the strengthening headwinds. In the engine room, Thompson's team continued their repairs while being thrown around by the ship's violent movements. At 2:30 p.m., disaster struck without warning. A massive wave slammed into the port side of the vessel, causing the ship to roll severely to starboard. In the engine room, the violent motion caused a critical fuel line to rupture. Within minutes, the port engine began to sputter and lose power as fuel pressure dropped dangerously low. Thompson watched in horror as their remaining engine began to fail. He tried desperately to maintain fuel flow, but the damage was too extensive. The engine coughed once, twice, then fell silent. The Northern Star was now dead in the water, completely at the mercy of the storm that was rapidly approaching their position. Emergency procedures kicked in immediately. The crew deployed sea anchors to help stabilize the ship, while Thompson assessed the damage below. The fuel line rupture was repairable, but it would take several hours of work. More concerning was the fact that the violent motion had also damaged some of the electrical systems that controlled the engine management computers. Captain Rodriguez sent out a distress call, but their position was far from major shipping lanes. The nearest Coast Guard vessel was over 10 hours away, assuming it could even operate in the worsening conditions. As afternoon turned to evening, the storm continued to build, and the crew faced the terrifying prospect of riding out a major Atlantic storm without power. The ship rolled and pitched helplessly in the growing swells. Without engine power, they couldn't maintain their heading or stability. Everything loose in the ship became a potential projectile. In the galley, dishes crashed to the floor. In the crew quarters, personal belongings scattered across the small cabins with each violent roll. Thompson worked frantically in the engine room, knowing that every minute without power made their situation more dangerous. The fuel line repair was progressing, but the electrical problems were proving more challenging than expected. Salt water had somehow gotten into several control panels, causing short circuits and system failures throughout the engine management network. As darkness fell, the crew gathered in the main mess hall for an emergency meeting. Captain Rodriguez explained their situation honestly. They were without power in deteriorating weather conditions, with help still many hours away. The mood was tense but determined. These were experienced sailors who had faced storms before, but never while completely helpless and drifting. The night brought new challenges as the storm reached its full fury. Waves towered above the ship, crashing down with tremendous force. The crew took shifts monitoring the hull for damage, while Thompson's team continued their desperate repair efforts. Time was running out, and everyone knew that their survival might depend on getting at least one engine running before the storm reached its peak intensity. Cures content and purring in the sun. Dawn brought no relief from the storm's fury. The Northern Star continued to drift helplessly as massive waves battered her hull from all directions. In the engine room, Thompson and his exhausted crew had worked through the night making slow progress on the fuel line repairs. Their hands were cut and bruised from working with tools in the violent motion, and fatigue was beginning to take its toll. The electrical problems proved more serious than initially thought. Salt water had penetrated deeper into the control systems than Thompson had realized. Several critical circuit boards were completely fried, and without them, even if they fixed the fuel line, the engines wouldn't start. The computerized management systems that modern ships relied on had become their biggest obstacle. Davis suggested trying to bypass the computer controls and start the engines manually. But Thompson shook his head grimly. The engines were too sophisticated for such crude methods. They needed the electronic systems to manage fuel injection, timing, and safety protocols. Without proper computer control, attempting to start the engines could cause even more damage or potentially create a dangerous explosion. Captain Rodriguez received regular updates from the engine room, each one more discouraging than the last. The Coast Guard had confirmed that rescue vessels were en route, but the storm was slowing their progress significantly. The nearest ship was still at least 6 hours away, possibly longer if conditions continued to worsen. On deck, the crew struggled to secure equipment that had broken loose during the night. The ship's violent rolling had torn several storage containers from their moorings, and debris scattered across the deck posed additional hazards. First Officer Kelly led a team of sailors in a dangerous mission to clear the worst obstacles while being constantly drenched by spray from the towering waves. In the radio room, Communications Officer Martinez maintained constant contact with rescue coordination centers. He plotted the positions of approaching vessels and monitored weather updates. The storm was expected to continue for at least another 12 hours, with wave heights potentially reaching 30 feet or more. Even when help arrived, conducting a rescue in such conditions would be extremely dangerous. Below deck, the crew struggled with seasickness as the ship rolled through increasingly violent arcs. Without engine power to maintain stability, the vessel moved with the natural motion of the waves, creating a nauseating corkscrew motion that left even experienced sailors feeling sick. The galley had been shut down completely, as cooking had become impossible and dangerous. Thompson made a desperate decision to attempt repairs on the most critical control board. Using spare parts cannibalized from non-essential systems, he and Davis worked to rebuild the damaged circuits. It was delicate work made nearly impossible by the ship's motion. Every few minutes, a particularly violent roll would send them sliding across the engine room floor, tools scattering in all directions. The psychological pressure was mounting on everyone aboard. Being helpless in a storm at sea triggered primal fears that even experienced sailors found difficult to suppress. Some crew members began sharing stories of other ships that had been lost in similar conditions. Captain Rodriguez quickly put a stop to such talk, knowing that maintaining morale was crucial for survival. By midday, Thompson achieved a small breakthrough. He managed to restore power to one of the engine control units, though it was operating with severely limited functionality. The system could potentially manage basic engine operations, but without the safety protocols and monitoring systems, starting the engine would be extremely risky. The fuel line repairs were finally completed, but testing revealed another problem. The violent motion had caused sediment in the fuel tanks to stir up, potentially clogging filters and injectors. Thompson realized they would need to flush the entire fuel system before attempting to restart either engine, a process that could take several more hours. As afternoon approached, the storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, the waves seemed to be getting larger and more chaotic. The ship was taking on some water through minor hull damage, though the pumps were keeping pace for now. However, the electrical failures had also affected some of the automatic bilge systems, forcing crew members to operate manual pumps on a rotating schedule. A new crisis emerged when the ship's emergency generator began showing signs of strain. This backup power source was keeping essential systems running, including lights, communications, and navigation equipment. If it failed, they would be completely in the dark, unable to signal for help or coordinate rescue efforts. Thompson faced an agonizing decision. He could attempt to start one of the main engines with the partially repaired control system, but the risk was enormous. If something went wrong, they could lose their last chance at power and potentially cause a fire or explosion that would doom the entire ship. Alternatively, they could wait for more complete repairs, but time was running out as the storm continued to pound their helpless vessel. The crew gathered again for another emergency meeting. Captain Rodriguez explained the situation honestly, including Thompson's assessment of the risks involved in attempting an engine restart. The decision wasn't his alone to make. In these circumstances, the survival of everyone aboard depended on choosing the right course of action. Some crew members argued for attempting the restart immediately, believing that having even limited engine power was better than remaining completely helpless. Others supported waiting for more complete repairs, feeling that the risks of a catastrophic failure were too great. The debate was intense but respectful, with everyone understanding that their lives hung in the balance. As evening approached, exhaustion was taking its toll on everyone. The crew had been fighting the storm and working on repairs for over 24 hours with little rest. Mistakes were becoming more frequent, and concentration was wavering. Thompson knew that fatigue was becoming as dangerous as the storm itself. The decision was finally made to attempt a restart of the port engine using the partially repaired control system. The risks were significant, but the alternative of remaining powerless in the worsening storm seemed even more dangerous. Thompson and his team began final preparations for what everyone knew would be their best and possibly only chance to restore power to their vessel. The engine room fell silent except for the thunderous sound of waves crashing against the hull. Thompson stood before the partially repaired control panel, his hand hovering over the engine start sequence. Davis and two other engineers positioned themselves at manual override stations, ready to shut down everything at the first sign of trouble. Everyone understood that this moment would determine whether they lived or died. Thompson pressed the first button in the startup sequence. Fuel pumps whirred to life and gauges began showing pressure readings throughout the system. So far, the repaired components were responding normally. He continued through the checklist, each step bringing them closer to the critical moment when the engine would attempt to fire. The preliminaries completed successfully. Fuel pressure was stable, electrical systems were functioning within acceptable parameters, and all manual safety overrides were in position. Thompson looked around at his team one final time, then pressed the engine start button. For a moment, nothing happened except the usual whirring of the starter motor. Then, like a miracle, the engine coughed once and caught. The massive diesel rumbled to life, sending vibrations through the ship's hull that the crew felt in their bones. Cheers erupted throughout the vessel as word spread that they had power again. But Thompson's celebration was short-lived as he noticed several warning lights flashing on his makeshift control panel. The engine was running, but not smoothly. Without the full computer management system, fuel injection timing was slightly off, causing irregular combustion. The temperature gauges showed readings that were higher than normal, but still within operational limits. Thompson realized they had achieved a partial victory, but the engine was operating in a compromised state that couldn't be sustained indefinitely. Captain Rodriguez felt the ship's motion change as the propeller began turning again. With engine power restored, he could finally maintain some control over their heading and stability. He immediately ordered a course toward the nearest safe harbor, still over 100 miles away but now within reach. The storm continued to rage, but they were no longer completely at its mercy. In the engine room, Thompson and his team monitored every gauge and system reading with intense concentration. The patched-together control system was holding, but they all knew it was a temporary solution. They needed to reach port before something else failed, and the partially repaired engine was their only lifeline. The restored propulsion allowed the ship to take the waves at a better angle, reducing the violent rolling motion that had plagued them for hours. Crew members who had been seasick began to recover as the ship's movement became more predictable. Morale improved dramatically throughout the vessel, though everyone remained aware that their situation was still precarious. However, their relief was premature. After running for 2 hours, the engine began showing signs of increasing strain. Temperature readings climbed steadily higher, and a new vibration developed in the propulsion system. Thompson suspected that debris in the fuel system was beginning to clog injectors, reducing efficiency and causing the engine to work harder than normal. The fuel filters needed changing, but this required shutting down the engine temporarily. Thompson faced another difficult decision. They could continue running with decreasing efficiency until the engine eventually failed, or they could shut down voluntarily to perform maintenance with the hope of improving reliability for the remainder of their journey. Captain Rodriguez calculated their position and progress toward shore. They had covered significant distance since restoring power, but were still over 70 miles from the nearest harbor. Shutting down the engine now would mean drifting again, possibly losing much of the progress they had made. Yet continuing with a degrading engine might result in permanent failure when they were almost within reach of safety. The decision was made to continue running while preparing for emergency maintenance procedures. Thompson's team readied replacement filters and tools needed for a rapid changeover. If the engine performance degraded too severely, they would attempt the filter change as quickly as possible and hope the engine would restart afterward. As night fell again, the storm showed the first signs of beginning to weaken. Wave heights were still dangerous, but the sustained winds had dropped slightly. More importantly, the weather forecast indicated that conditions would continue to improve over the next 6 to 8 hours. If they could keep the engine running until dawn, they might reach calmer waters. The Coast Guard had maintained radio contact throughout their ordeal, providing regular position updates and coordinating with nearby vessels. A container ship had altered course to provide assistance if needed, though it was still several hours away. Having potential rescue nearby improved morale, even though everyone hoped they wouldn't need it. Thompson noticed that fuel consumption was increasing as the engine worked harder to maintain the same power output. At their current rate of consumption, they might not have enough fuel to reach port if efficiency continued to decline. He began calculations to determine the optimal balance between speed and fuel conservation for the remainder of their journey. The crew worked in shifts to monitor all systems and watch for signs of new problems. Fatigue was still a major concern, but the restored sense of purpose and forward progress helped everyone maintain focus. They were no longer helpless victims of the storm. They were actively fighting their way toward safety. In the radio room, Martinez received updates from maritime rescue coordination centers. Several vessels were being repositioned to provide assistance if needed, and helicopters would be available for emergency evacuation once weather conditions improved enough for flight operations. The knowledge that help was being organized provided additional comfort to the crew. The partially repaired engine continued to run despite increasing signs of strain. Thompson's team made minor adjustments to optimize performance, but they were limited by the compromised control systems. Every gauge reading was manually logged, and trends were carefully monitored to predict when critical failures might occur. As midnight approached, they had covered almost half the remaining distance to port. The engine was still running, though performance continued to degrade slowly. Thompson estimated they might be able to maintain power for another 6 to 8 hours if they were careful about engine management. With luck and continued improvement in weather conditions, it might be just enough to reach safety. The situation took a dramatic turn for the worse just after 2 a.m. Thompson was monitoring the engine controls when several alarms sounded simultaneously. Oil pressure was dropping rapidly, and temperature readings spiked beyond safe operating limits. The fuel injection system began misfiring, causing the engine to run roughly and lose power output significantly. Davis rushed to check the physical engine components, while Thompson tried to diagnose the problem through the limited control systems. What they discovered was devastating. The makeshift repairs and compromised fuel system had finally taken their toll. Multiple systems were failing at once, and the engine was on the verge of complete breakdown. Thompson made the agonizing decision to shut down the engine before it suffered catastrophic damage that would make any future restart impossible. As the propulsion died, the Northern Star once again became a helpless victim of the storm. The temporary reprieve they had enjoyed for 6 precious hours was over, and they were back to drifting at the mercy of wind and waves. Captain Rodriguez received the news with growing despair. They had managed to cover significant distance while they had power, reducing the gap to safety to about 40 miles, but 40 miles might as well have been 400 without engine power. The storm was still strong enough to push them away from shore faster than they could drift toward it. The crew's morale plummeted as word spread that they were once again powerless. The brief taste of progress and control made their return to helplessness even more demoralizing. Some crew members began to voice doubts about their chances of survival. Though Captain Rodriguez quickly moved to address these concerns and maintain discipline, Thompson and his team returned to the engine room to assess what could be salvaged. The diagnosis was grim. The oil system had suffered additional damage and several critical components had overheated beyond repair. Even if they had unlimited time and perfect working conditions, fixing the engine would require parts they simply didn't have aboard. The starboard engine, which had been shut down since the beginning of their ordeal, remained their only hope. Thompson turned his attention to the original seal failure that had started their problems. The repair work that had been interrupted by the port engine crisis was still incomplete, but it represented their last chance at restoring any kind of propulsion. Working by emergency lighting in the violently moving engine room, Thompson's exhausted team began dismantling the starboard engine's damaged components. The work was even more difficult now, as fatigue and stress had taken a severe toll on everyone's coordination and judgment. Simple tasks that should have taken minutes stretched into hours. The storm continued to batter the ship with unrelenting fury. Without the partial stability they had enjoyed while under power, the vessel returned to the violent corkscrew motion that made every task a struggle. Tools scattered across the deck with each roll, and maintaining footing became a constant challenge that slowed all repair efforts. Captain Rodriguez calculated their drift rate and remaining distance to shore. The mathematics were discouraging. Even if they could restore power within the next few hours, they would still need several more hours of running time to reach safety. The window for successful escape was closing rapidly, and weather forecasts showed that while the storm was slowly weakening, it would remain dangerous for at least another 12 hours. Emergency supplies were running low throughout the ship. Fresh water was being carefully rationed, and food supplies were limited since the galley remained unusable. The crew was operating on adrenaline and determination alone, sustained by the knowledge that giving up meant certain death in the cold Atlantic waters. Martinez continued monitoring radio communications, providing regular position updates to rescue coordination centers. The nearest Coast Guard vessel was making progress toward their position, but was still hours away. More concerning was the fact that even when rescue ships arrived, conducting evacuation operations in current sea conditions would be extremely dangerous. Thompson made a crucial discovery while examining the starboard engine damage. The seal failure had been caused by improper installation during their last port maintenance. The repair itself was actually simpler than they had originally thought, but it required precision work that was nearly impossible to achieve in their current conditions. The crew held another emergency meeting to discuss their options. Thompson estimated that repairing the starboard engine would take at least 4 to 6 hours under ideal conditions, possibly twice that long given their circumstances. Captain Rodriguez shared updated drift calculations, showing that they were slowly but steadily moving away from shore due to wind and current patterns. First Officer Kelly proposed a desperate plan. If they could deploy all available sea anchors and improvised drag devices, they might be able to slow their drift rate enough to buy Thompson additional time for repairs. It would require exposing crew members to extreme danger on deck, but it might be their only chance. The decision was made to implement Kelly's plan while Thompson continued engine repairs. Volunteers stepped forward to handle the dangerous deck work, knowing that one mistake could mean being swept overboard in the towering seas. Safety lines were rigged throughout the ship to provide some protection for the crew working on deck. As dawn approached, Both operations proceeded simultaneously. On deck, Kelly's team fought to deploy additional sea anchors while being constantly drenched by spray and threatened by loose equipment. Below, Thompson's engineers worked frantically to complete the seal replacement that represented their last hope for restoration of power. The psychological strain was becoming as dangerous as the physical challenges. Crew members were reaching the limits of human endurance, having fought the storm for over 36 hours with little rest. Mistakes were becoming more frequent, and the constant stress was beginning to affect decision-making abilities throughout the ship. Thompson achieved a breakthrough when he successfully removed the damaged seal without causing additional harm to surrounding components. The replacement process could now begin, though it would require several more hours of painstaking work. Every minute counted as their drift away from shore continued relentlessly, despite the crew's efforts to slow it. Communication with rescue vessels provided some hope, but also highlighted their deteriorating situation. The Coast Guard confirmed that helicopter evacuation would be impossible until weather conditions improved significantly. Surface rescue remained their only option, but coordinating such an operation would require precise timing and favorable conditions that seemed increasingly unlikely. Thompson was deep in concentration, carefully positioning the replacement seal in the starboard engine, when Davis suddenly grabbed his arm. Both men froze as they heard something impossible over the storm's roar: footsteps in the engine room. Heavy, deliberate steps that seemed to move with purpose despite the ship's violent motion. They looked at each other in confusion, knowing that all crew members were accounted for elsewhere on the vessel. The footsteps stopped directly behind them. Thompson turned slowly, expecting to see one of the crew who had somehow entered without their notice. Instead, he found himself staring at a figure that seemed to materialize from the shadows between the massive engine blocks. The man was elderly, perhaps in his 70s, with weathered features and penetrating blue eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of countless storms. What struck Thompson most was the stranger's clothing. He wore a heavy wool peacoat that appeared to be decades old, and his weathered sea captain's cap bore insignia that Thompson didn't recognize. Most inexplicable of all, the man remained perfectly steady on his feet despite the ship's violent rolling, as if the motion that had been plaguing the crew for days simply didn't affect him. Davis stumbled backward, his tools clattering to the deck. Neither engineer could speak as the mysterious figure stepped closer to examine their work. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried the authority of someone who had spent a lifetime commanding ships in dangerous waters. He didn't introduce himself or explain his presence. Instead, he simply said, "You're approaching this repair incorrectly." The old man knelt beside the engine with surprising agility, his movements fluid and confident. Without asking permission, he began examining the seal installation with practiced hands. Thompson found his voice and started to protest, but something in the stranger's demeanor suggested that interrupting would be unwise. "I've seen this exact failure pattern before," the mysterious figure continued, his hands working with the precision of someone intimately familiar with marine engines. "The problem isn't just the seal itself, but the mounting surface. You need to address the underlying cause, or the new seal will fail within hours of restart." Thompson watched in amazement as the stranger identified problems that their diagnostic equipment had missed. Using tools that seemed to appear from nowhere, the old man began making adjustments to components that the crew hadn't even considered part of the repair process. His movements were economical and purposeful, wasting no motion despite the ship's continued violent movement. "Who are you?" Davis finally managed to ask, but the stranger didn't respond immediately. Instead, he continued working, his experienced hands moving through the repair process with an efficiency that made Thompson's earlier efforts seem clumsy by comparison. It was as if the man had performed this exact repair countless times before. As the mysterious figure worked, he began sharing knowledge that went far beyond simple mechanical repair. He explained subtle aspects of engine management that weren't covered in any manual Thompson had ever read. His understanding of marine propulsion systems seemed to encompass decades of practical experience with equipment spanning multiple generations of technology. "The fuel system contamination you've been fighting," the stranger said without looking up from his work, "can be cleared using the emergency flush protocol that most engineers have forgotten." The procedure was standard on vessels built in the 1980s, but it's not documented in modern manuals, Thompson exchanged glances with Davis, both men wondering how this mysterious individual could know about their fuel system problems. They hadn't mentioned the contamination issue to anyone outside the engine room crew, yet the stranger spoke about it as if he had been monitoring their repair efforts from the beginning. Working with remarkable speed, the old man completed modifications to the seal mounting that would have taken Thompson's team several more hours. His technique involved procedures that seemed to come from an earlier era of marine engineering, yet they were perfectly adapted to the modern equipment. It was as if he bridged decades of technological development through pure experience. The control system damage, he continued while making final adjustments, can be bypassed using manual overrides that are still functional. Most engineers rely too heavily on computerized management and forget that these engines were designed to run mechanically if necessary. As the stranger worked, Thompson noticed details about him that seemed increasingly unusual. His tools appeared to be well-maintained vintage equipment that should have been obsolete decades ago, yet they worked perfectly with the modern engine components. His clothing, while clearly old, showed no signs of the wear and damage that everyone else aboard had suffered during their ordeal. Most puzzling of all was the man's apparent immunity to the ship's motion. While Thompson and Davis struggled to maintain their balance and keep tools from sliding across the deck, the mysterious figure moved as if the ship were perfectly stable. His hands never wavered and his footing never shifted, despite the violent rolling that had been throwing crew members around for days. The repair work proceeded with extraordinary efficiency under the stranger's guidance. Components that had seemed hopelessly damaged were restored to functionality through techniques that Thompson had never encountered. The old man's knowledge seemed to encompass not just mechanical repair, but an intuitive understanding of how ships behaved in extreme weather conditions. "Your fuel injection timing will need adjustment after restart," the stranger explained, making notes on a piece of paper that appeared as weathered as everything else about him. "The contamination has affected the injector response time. Use these settings for the first 30 minutes of operation, then gradually adjust to normal parameters." Thompson accepted the handwritten notes, noticing that the paper felt strange under his fingers, almost as if it were from another era. The writing was clear and precise, with technical specifications that addressed every problem they had encountered during their ordeal. It was as if the stranger had anticipated every challenge they would face. As the repair neared completion, the mysterious figure began preparing to leave as suddenly as he had arrived. Thompson realized that he still knew nothing about who this man was or how he had come to be aboard their vessel. When he pressed for answers, the stranger simply smiled and said, "Sometimes experience finds its way to where it's needed most." The old man gathered his vintage tools with the same efficiency he had displayed throughout the repair process. As he prepared to disappear back into the shadows of the engine room, he offered one final piece of advice that would prove crucial in the hours ahead. "When you restart the engine," the mysterious stranger said, pausing at the edge of the engine room's shadows, "don't trust your instruments initially. The electrical damage has affected sensor calibration. Listen to the engine itself, it will tell you what the gauges cannot." With those words, he stepped backward into the darkness between the massive machinery and simply vanished, leaving Thompson and Davis staring at empty space. The two engineers looked at each other in bewilderment, wondering if exhaustion and stress had caused them to hallucinate the entire encounter. But the evidence of the stranger's work was undeniable. The engine repair had been completed with a precision and expertise that far exceeded their own capabilities. Components that had seemed beyond salvation were now restored to better condition than they had been before the original failure. Thompson examined the repair work more closely, marveling at the craftsmanship. The seal installation was perfect, with additional modifications that addressed potential failure points they hadn't even identified. The mounting surfaces had been restored to specifications that exceeded original factory tolerances. It was the work of someone with decades of experience and an intuitive understanding of marine engineering. Davis picked up the handwritten notes the stranger had left behind, studying the technical specifications with growing amazement. The instructions covered problems they hadn't yet encountered but would likely face during restart and initial operation. It was as if the mysterious figure had foreseen every challenge they would meet in the coming hours. Word of the completed repair spread quickly through the ship, bringing the first genuine hope the crew had felt in days. Captain Rodriguez arrived in the engine room to assess the situation personally. When Thompson and Davis attempted to explain about the mysterious stranger who had completed the work, the captain's expression showed polite skepticism, mixed with concern about their mental state. "There's no one aboard this vessel who wasn't accounted for during our last muster," Captain Rodriguez stated firmly. "Every crew member is accounted for, and we haven't taken anyone else aboard." He examined the repair work, however, and had to admit that the quality was exceptional, regardless of who had performed it. Thompson decided not to press the issue of the stranger's identity. The important thing was that the engine was repaired and ready for restart. He began following the startup procedures, incorporating the mysterious figures, advice about ignoring instrument readings initially, and listening to the engine's actual performance. The startup sequence proceeded more smoothly than any of them had dared hope. The engine caught on the first attempt and settled into a steady rhythm that sounded healthier than it had in months. Thompson followed the stranger's instructions, making timing adjustments based on audible cues rather than sensor readings, and the performance continued to improve. As power returned to the ship's propulsion system, Captain Rodriguez felt control return to his vessel. The stabilization was immediate and dramatic, as the ship's motion changed from chaotic rolling to the purposeful movement of a vessel under command. For the first time in over 40 hours, they were no longer at the mercy of wind and waves. The crew's celebration was tempered by caution, as everyone remembered the previous engine failure that had dashed their hopes so dramatically. Thompson monitored every aspect of the engine's performance, but all indications suggested that this repair was fundamentally different from their earlier attempts. The engine ran smoothly and efficiently, showing none of the warning signs that had preceded the previous breakdown. Captain Rodriguez immediately set course for the nearest harbor, calculating their position and estimated arrival time. With the storm finally beginning to weaken significantly, they had a realistic chance of reaching safety before encountering any new crises. The harbor was still over 30 miles away, but the distance no longer seemed insurmountable. In the engine room, Thompson continued to monitor the propulsion system according to the stranger's written instructions. The recommendations proved remarkably accurate, with each suggested adjustment improving performance exactly as predicted. It was as if the notes had been written by someone who had intimate knowledge of this specific engine's characteristics. The fuel system contamination that had plagued their earlier efforts showed dramatic improvement under the stranger's prescribed treatment protocol. The emergency flush procedure he had described cleared blockages that conventional methods had failed to address. Fuel flow stabilized and engine efficiency returned to normal parameters for the first time since their ordeal began. As hours passed, confidence in the repair grew throughout the ship. The engine continued to perform flawlessly, maintaining steady power output and showing no signs of the strain that had characterized their previous attempts. Thompson began to believe that they had finally achieved a sustainable solution to their propulsion problems. The weather continued to improve as dawn approached for the third time since their crisis began. Wave heights were dropping steadily, and wind speeds had decreased to levels that no longer posed an immediate threat to navigation. The storm that had nearly destroyed them was finally moving away, leaving behind calmer seas and clearing skies. Communication with rescue vessels brought welcome news. The Coast Guard cutter that had been fighting its way toward their position reported that it was now within 10 miles and closing rapidly. While the Northern Star no longer needed immediate rescue, having escort vessels nearby provided additional security as they made their way toward port. Captain Rodriguez began considering the implications of their mysterious benefactor. As a practical man, he struggled to explain the stranger's appearance and subsequent disappearance. The crew members who had been working on deck reported no sightings of anyone moving through the ship, and the engine room had only one practical entrance that had been under constant observation. Thompson found himself studying the handwritten notes repeatedly, searching for clues about their author's identity. The paper felt genuinely aged, and the ink had a quality that suggested it had been written years ago rather than hours. The technical knowledge displayed was remarkable, covering engineering principles and procedures that spanned multiple decades of maritime technology development. As they approached the halfway point to harbor, Davis made a discovery that sent chills through the engine room crew. While cleaning up their tools and equipment, He found an old photograph wedged behind one of the engine mounts. The image showed the same elderly man who had helped them, standing on the deck of what appeared to be a cargo vessel from the 1970s or 1980s. The photograph bore a handwritten inscription on the back. Chief Engineer William McCormick, SS Atlantic Trader, 1975-1989. Davis showed the image to Thompson, who immediately recognized the face of their mysterious benefactor. But the inscription raised more questions than it answered, suggesting that their helper should have been much younger when the photo was taken decades ago. Thompson decided to research the name when they reached port, but for now, he was content to focus on maintaining their restored propulsion and completing their journey to safety. Whatever the explanation for their mysterious assistance, it had undoubtedly saved their lives and brought them within reach of rescue. The harbor lights appeared on the horizon, just as the sun began to set on their third day at sea. The Northern Star approached the breakwater under her own power, her engine running as smoothly as the day she had left port. Coast Guard vessels flanked them on both sides, a precautionary escort that had proven unnecessary but deeply appreciated by everyone aboard. Captain Rodriguez guided his ship through the harbor entrance with profound relief. Behind them, the storm that had nearly claimed their lives was a dark line on the horizon, moving away toward the northeast. The contrast between the chaotic violence of the open ocean and the calm protection of the harbor seemed almost surreal after their harrowing experience. Crowds had gathered at the dock, including family members who had been notified of their distress situation. News of their ordeal had spread through the maritime community, and their successful arrival was being celebrated as a remarkable example of seamanship and determination in the face of overwhelming odds. As the ship secured to the pier, Thompson remained in the engine room, conducting a final inspection of the mysterious repairs that had saved their lives. Every component showed signs of masterful craftsmanship that exceeded anything he had seen in his 20-year career. The work had not only solved their immediate crisis but had actually improved the engine's overall performance beyond its original specifications. Davis had spent the final hours of their journey researching the name they had found on the photograph. Using the ship's satellite internet connection, he had discovered records of Chief Engineer William McCormick, who had indeed served aboard the SS Atlantic Trader during the time period indicated. The records also revealed something that left both engineers speechless with amazement. According to maritime accident reports, McCormick had been lost at sea in 1989 when the Atlantic Trader encountered a severe storm in the same general area where the Northern Star had experienced its engine failure. The vessel had suffered complete power loss and had been overwhelmed by massive waves before rescue ships could reach them. McCormick had stayed at his post in the engine room, attempting repairs until the very end. The official investigation had concluded that McCormick's extensive knowledge and decades of experience might have saved the ship if he had been given just a few more hours to complete his emergency repairs. Instead, he had gone down with his vessel, his body never recovered from the cold Atlantic waters. Thompson stared at the photograph and the research findings, struggling to process the implications. The man who had appeared in their engine room and saved their lives had died 36 years ago, in the same waters where they had faced their own crisis. The logical part of his mind rejected such a possibility, but the evidence was undeniable. When port engineers boarded to inspect their repairs, they were astounded by the quality and sophistication of the work. The techniques used were a blend of old-school craftsmanship and modern engineering that created solutions superior to anything in current repair manuals. Several components showed modifications that the inspectors had never seen before but recognized as brilliant improvements to the original. Design Captain Rodriguez filed his official report with harbor authorities, detailing their engine failures, the storm encounter, and their successful emergency repairs. When asked about who had performed the crucial repair work that saved the vessel, he credited his engineering team while making no mention of their mysterious benefactor. Some things, he decided, were better left unexplained. The crew was debriefed by maritime safety investigators who were studying their experience to improve emergency procedures for similar situations. Thompson and Davis chose not to mention their encounter with the Phantom engineer, knowing that such claims would likely be attributed to stress and exhaustion. The important thing was that everyone had survived and valuable lessons had been learned. Thompson kept the photograph and handwritten repair notes as personal mementos of their experience. He had them analyzed by maritime historians who confirmed the age of both the paper and the photographic materials. The ink analysis showed chemical signatures consistent with writing instruments used decades ago, further supporting the impossibility of their situation. Word of their story spread through the maritime engineering community, focusing on the remarkable repairs that had been achieved under impossible conditions. Thompson became something of a legend among marine engineers, though he never took full credit for work that he knew had been performed by someone else entirely. 6 months later, Thompson was promoted to Fleet Chief Engineer based partly on the recognition he received for the innovative repair techniques demonstrated during the Northern Star incident. In his new position, he made it his mission to research and document traditional maritime repair methods that were being lost as the industry became increasingly dependent on computerized systems. Davis eventually transferred to a shore-based position, admitting that his experience aboard the Northern Star had fundamentally changed his relationship with the sea. He never felt entirely comfortable on deep ocean voyages again, though he continued to work in marine engineering, where his expertise was valued and respected. The Northern Star herself was retrofitted with improved emergency backup systems and redundant engine controls to prevent similar failures in the future. The modifications incorporated several of the techniques that had been demonstrated during their crisis, improving the vessel's overall reliability and safety margins. Captain Rodriguez continued commanding merchant vessels for several more years before retiring to become a maritime instructor. He often told the story of their 3-day ordeal to students, emphasizing the importance of crew teamwork, persistence in the face of adversity, and the value of traditional seamanship skills that could mean the difference between life and death. Thompson never encountered another situation that required the kind of extraordinary intervention they had experienced during the storm. But he kept the photograph of William McCormick on his desk as a reminder that the sea holds mysteries that defy rational explanation. He had learned that sometimes when the situation is most desperate and conventional solutions have failed, help can come from the most unexpected sources. The official records show that the crew of the Northern Star survived their ordeal through exceptional engineering skill, determination, and favorable weather conditions. The full truth of their rescue remains known only to Thompson and Davis, who continue to honor the memory of a phantom engineer whose expertise transcended the boundaries between life and death to save 23 souls from the merciless Atlantic.